Good afternoon, and welcome to Commodity Wars. Today's commodity is beef. As per usual, we have 3 mini segments: long history, production, and mass consumption. So let's get this started with our first episode, A Moo Hope.
In the 17th and 18th century, we saw a global flow of goods and services through the triangular trade. Labor was sent from Africa to the Americas sent raw materials to Europe, and then Europe sent manufactured goods to the rest of the world. What's really interesting is how beef as a commodity fit into this triangular trade.
Beef was more or less sought after economically. It was specifically demanded to feed the slaves that produced sugarcane. Europeans wanted more sugar, so sugarcane was needed to be made. But what else do you need? Food. And that food was supplied by the Irish in the form of Irish salt beef.
So was salt beef mandated in any way? Why was salt beef the chosen commodity?
It's simple. It was cheap. If we look at the relationship between the French and British crowns and Ireland, these crowns mandated that slaves consume 3 pounds of salt beef a week.
So you mentioned the crown, the French and British crowns. Ireland was not considered one of these imperial powers. So were they almost predetermined to fill this role of beef production?
Definitely. Ireland was not an imperial power, so they weren't reaping the same benefits. They had to get through by other means. They had enough land and enough labor to mature the infant beef production industry, and they were right next door to these nations that needed a source of food for their slave labor. I definitely agree that they were predisposed to fill that role.
So Adrian, it sounds like you're agreeing with Jared Diamond's definition of environmental determinism, in which a geographical location will determine the success of its political, social, and economic advancements?
Definitely. They were neighboring these colonizing powers who needed food, and they were producing food. They were in the right place at the right time.
All right, we got to move on to our next segment, Episode 5, The Industry Strikes Back. But first, a word from our sponsors. Do you ever feel like you're stuck on a desert planet with no way to escape? Well then, the Scoundrel app is just for you. Sign up now to find a local smuggler near you. Everybody needs a Han, so let us give you one. Scoundrel. Alrighty. So, in the first portion we talked about the importing of slaves to provide labor. How is this similar to the importing of immigrant labor in today's beef industry? Janneth?
A good example would be the shifts of labor in the meatpacking factories here in the U.S. in the last 50 years. Before the use of immigrant labor, workers were actually paid decent wages and were unionized. The first shift happened when an increase of mass consumption kind of put a strain on factories and workers. So this prompted the use of more mobile labor forces. And here in the United States, that was the Mexican immigrants. Without unionization or a voice, Mexican immigrants suffered long hours, unsafe working conditions, and very little pay.
As Enlo noted, there was a similar situation in South Korea. American shoe companies exploited female labor until they were given labor rights. In response, these companies pulled out of South Korea to find more exploitable labor markets. Do we see a similar trend in the American beef industry?
Yes, we actually do. Just like South Korean women, these immigrant workers dealt with the same vulnerability trait shaped by both class and gender. Immigrant workers did eventually unionize and demand more rights, but similar to South Korean women in these shoemaking factories, the beef industry replaced them with a new and more mobile labor force. These were the ones that were still vulnerable. So currently in the United States, we have immigrants from East Africa and Southeast Asia who are the new sources of labor. These factories continue to fuel our demand for beef.
As you mentioned, Janneth, increased production and mass consumption go hand in hand. So let's move on to Episode 6, the consumption of the masses. So with mass consumption, we see the commoditization and fetishization of goods. Can the same be said with beef?
Yes, according to Marx, this fetishism occurs when society adds magical value to a commodity beyond its pragmatic value, its actual use. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 created stricter guidelines of quality inspection of meat. This led consumers to believe that meat inspected in the U.S. was now worth more.
So this nationally assured quality increases its value? Can that be seen as a sense of nationalism about a product?
Yes, the consumption of meat, especially hamburgers, was fetishized in America and became one of the staples of Western and modern culture. For example, McDonald's, which is an American multinational, is a global sponsor of the Olympics. They run ads showing their relationship with some of the best athletes in the United States and around the world. Globalization through the sponsorships and the ads that are run empower these people that they too can be successful as Olympic athletes. It sets the standard for global consumption of beef. Bester explains the same with sushi, as it was fetishized in Japan and became a global commodity through globalization. This Western idea that consuming this foreign cuisine was the sign of status.
Right, and we can see the same in the correlation of mass consumption of meat and economic development. As globalization mobilizes different industries and cultures, such as the American culture of beef, we see an increased consumption of beef through fast food. When people have more money to spend, their meat consumption increases because it is representative of a sort of economic status.
It definitely gives it a certain status, and as consumption of a more valued commodity increases, it becomes more desired. Eventually, as we see with beef and sushi and so many others, commodities become fetishized. So this brings us to the end of our journey.
We hope you've all enjoyed this episode of
Commodity Wars.
Stay safe, and may the Force be with you.